Western Scotland, the favoured spots for some drier and brighter interludes at times through the day and overnight. Clearing skies across parts of northern UK in particular, with lighter winds eventually will lead to a touch of frost in places, say for northeast England, parts of central Scotland. Otherwise, lots of cloud and further showers coming and going, one or two making their way further east as we start off Thursday. But eventually, by the afternoon, things do start to brighten up. Cloudy initially in the east, but by the afternoon, sunny spells coming through. Whilst a reversal of fortunes further west, it turns cloudy with areas of rain moving in by mid-afternoon. And the milder air returns to the southwest, 12 Celsius here, whilst it stays cold, where we've got the brighter weather further east. The cloud and rain make their way across the country during the evening. Some mountain snow for Scotland, followed by showers, and those showers will continue into Friday, particularly across western parts of the country, but there'll be some sunshine in between. And Saturday sees another area of rain move in from the west. It will also turn milder.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Join me, Alex Phillips, for the afternoon agenda on GB News, Monday to Thursday from 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. We don't lecture to you or try to tell you what to think. We do a deep delve into a topic with views from across the range of debate, therefore leaving you, the viewer, to make up your own mind. Join me, Alex Phillips, for the afternoon agenda on GB News, 4 till 6, Monday to Thursday. You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
And welcome to On the Money, your daily weekday dose of economics, business and consumer news. I'm Liam Halligan, and for the next hour, we'll be talking about the electricity industry as the national grid fails hundreds amid ongoing storms. That and a whole host of subjects with people who really know their stuff. But first is the GB News headlines with Paul Hawkins.
Thanks, Liam. Our top story at 1. Boris Johnson has announced an investigation into an alleged Downing Street Christmas party after a heated Prime Minister's questions this lunchtime. Follows a video leaked to ITV News showing the PM's former press secretary, Allegra Stratton, answering questions during a mock briefing 4 days after the alleged party happened, whilst the country was under lockdown restrictions. At PMQs this lunchtime, the Prime Minister said he was shocked by the video.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas party?
What's the answer?
I don't know. It
wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not. Is cheese and wine all right?
No.
It was a business meeting.
I'm joking.
I
can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. I've asked the Cabinet Secretary to establish all the facts and to report back as soon as possible.
But Labour's Sir Keir Starmer says the Prime Minister's apology raises more questions than answers.
They knew there was a party. They knew it was against the rules. They knew they couldn't admit it. And they thought it was funny. It's obvious what happened. The Prime Minister has been caught red-handed. Why doesn't he end the investigation right now by just admitting it, that we are facing a new variant? We may well be in Plan B this afternoon. Even the Prime Minister must understand the damage he's done to his credibility in enforcing the rules now and in the future.
Meanwhile, Boris Johnson is considering new COVID restrictions, including orders to work from home and vaccine passports to manage the Omicron variant. Downing Street sources insist no decision has been made. However, one of the UK's top COVID advisors has warned another nationwide lockdown cannot be ruled out. Professor Neil Ferguson says the Omicron variant is concerning, but it's not completely known what its impact will be. From today, if you're over 40 in England, you can now book your COVID booster jab 3 months after receiving your second vaccine. This change makes an extra 7 million people now eligible for the third jab. It's exactly a year ago to the day that the first coronavirus vaccine was given in the United Kingdom. Roughly 1,000 properties are without power after Storm Barra swept across the country. Power cuts follow Storm Arwen, which caused catastrophic damage to electricity networks. Flood warnings have been issued across the UK and a yellow weather warning for wind is in place across the west coast of Wales and southwest England until 6 p.m. More ice, wind and rain is expected elsewhere. The Met Office says Barra shouldn't cause as much chaos as Storm Arwen. The Mercedes Formula One team has ended its sponsorship deal with the insulation company Kingspan following a backlash over its links to Grenfell Tower. Kingspan made some of the insulation at Grenfell but says it wasn't involved in the design of the cladding system. 72 people were killed in a fire at the tower block in 2017. Boris Johnson and other Western leaders say they will work together to encourage Russia to back down over what they are calling threatening behaviour towards Ukraine. Their talks follow a meeting between President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, in which the US warned of severe sanctions if Russia invades Ukraine. An estimated 100,000 Russian troops are now gathered on the Ukrainian border. Boris Johnson says there will effectively be a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, as UK ministers will not be attending. This follows Australia's decision to join the US in a diplomatic boycott of next year's Olympics over human rights concerns. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison, meanwhile, says the boycott is the right thing to do. Despite the move, Australian and UK athletes will still be able to compete in the Games. You're up to date with the latest at 4 minutes past 1. We'll have more for you in half an hour.
Coming up on The Money today, this show is full of energy. That's right, we're discussing the future of the UK power industry and national grid after tens of thousands of households have been left without power in the aftermath of Storm Arwen. And only now, 12 days later, are the last households finally seeing their power restored. We'll be speaking to our North East reporter Rachel Sweeney about the impact of Storm Arwen on the ground and the latest Storm Barra across County Durham. Plus, each day on The Money features an in-depth Money Talks interview with a business leader, policymaker, or someone else with a particularly interesting perspective. Today, we're talking to Nick Allen, the CEO of Control Risks, a specialist risk consultancy which highlights some of the biggest risks facing the world today.
We have seen everywhere around the world, and this is something we and others have been talking about, has been the increase in political nationalism, the increase in trade barriers. If you look at just about every metric, you can see increases in barriers to trade, apart from Africa, actually. Africa is sort of moving in the other direction in some ways.
A rare interview with the CEO of Control Risks. That's later in the show. And as ever, send in your thoughts, opinions, suggestions. Were you affected by Storm Barra or Storm Arwen? Did you lose power? Let us know. GBviews at gbnews.uk or tweet at GBnews. Stay with us. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and you're on the money. Now, this time last week, Energy Minister Greg Hands was confronted during a visit to St John's Chapel, Weardale, where 3,000 households were without power. Storm Arwen, which disproportionately hit the north of England and Scotland, meant damage to transmission cables and other power infrastructure left tens of thousands of homes without electricity. Numerous local residents and politicians accused Hands and the government in general of failing to respond to the crisis. Residents across the north were only still without power due to the north-south divide, they said. The response to Storm Arwen shows opposition politicians claimed that Boris Johnson's government doesn't care about levelling up. As of this morning, we're told the remaining homes and businesses without power in the north-east of England have now had supplies restored, 12 days after Storm Arwen. Northern Power Grid said electricity was now back on in all 240,000 properties, affected by what the company called the worst storm in over 20 years. There were concerns Storm Barra, which is underway still, would hamper progress and cause further damage to buildings and trees. And some communities in County Durham and Northumberland are still relying on backup generators. But for the most part, normal service has been resumed. And now the dust is settling, it's time to assess what happened. Compensation payments related to Storm Arwen power losses may take months to arrive, say the power companies. And Northern Power Grid says the extent of the damage will take well into the new year to fix. Generators will be removed only once permanent repairs have been done. But there's a bigger issue here. What do these power outages mean for the future structure of our electricity industry? Back in the year 2000 and 2002, the UK's rail network was rocked by fatal train crashes at Hatfield and then Potters Bar. Following these tragedies, there was a consensus that something needed to change, and our then wholly privatised rail industry was reformed, with track maintenance and oversight brought back into the public sector. Now, the UK's electricity industry, with energy companies and the national grid privately owned, is coming under close scrutiny. Power companies are falling like flies, having misread the wholesale spot market for energy. And while, mercifully, no one has died due to these grid-related power cuts, no one should be left without electricity for 12 days in the depths of winter in a country like modern Britain. So that's our On the Money question today. In the aftermath of Storm Arwen electricity outages, does the UK's electric system need shock therapy? Here at On the Money, what we do is we host expert panels with people who really know their stuff. That's why we've got Councillor Scott James Dickinson with us. He's the Labour leader for Drudgeridge Bay in Northumberland. We've got Malcolm Grimston, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy at Imperial College London. And in the studio, it's our friend of the show, Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research, and, of course, former co-head of the government's Economic Service. Welcome to all of you. I think we should go firstly to you, Scott. Tell us what the latest situation is on the ground. We've got Rachel coming up to tell us from County Durham what she's seeing, but what are you seeing as a local councillor in terms of households? Has power been restored everywhere that you know, even if some people are still left using generators for now?
I think what we're seeing now, Liam, is people are restored somehow, whether it's a temporary generator or not. A lot of those generators are temperamental, and I think they've been going on and off, and some generator estates are reporting faults now, so we're just monitoring that closely to find out what's happening there so we can feed that into the power company.
Malcolm, let's turn to you. I mean, we're doing this subject in part because of a discussion that we had yesterday, if I may say so. To what extent do you think this may be a moment where, with all eyes on the power system, our utilities, something that most of us don't think about most of the time, though, of course, you do, given who you are, Do you think there may be a moment for change here? Do you think there might be a slightly grisly but resonant parallel between what we saw the train industry go through back in the early 2000s and the power industry now?
There could be. There's three things we need from our power supplies. We need them to be economic, we need them to be environmentally acceptable, and we need them to be secure. And those are often in tension. And I think it's probably fair to say that over the last 20 years, the focus has been more on reducing cost and environment than it's been on security of supply. This could well be a shake-up call or a wake-up call for us to remind ourselves just how vital secure supplies are. I'm sure Scott will have a lot of stories from his area of how difficult it is when people can't charge their mobile phone. You can't get at petrol because the pumps are electrically operated. All sorts of things that you don't immediately think of when you think about the lights going out. But of course do take time to put right after a serious outage like this. So yes, if we start to reprioritize secure supplies out of this, then inevitably that will have effect on how we view the whole industry as not just being a matter of trying to do it on the cheap, which frankly I think we've done in electricity in the last 20 years, plus of course the environment, which is important, but sometimes pulls in the opposite direction of secure supplies. For example, wind power is good for the environment, but not very good for security of supply.
Vicky, we've seen about 25 electricity companies fail over the last 3 months. Of course, wholesale gas prices have rocketed. A lot of those companies didn't hedge themselves on forward markets. They've had to pass those costs on. There's a price cap, of course. Even though the cap's gone up, those companies have gone bankrupt. It strikes me that the combination of that, millions of people having to move energy providers or having their providers moved for them by Ofgem, plus this 12 days to reconnect people, and even then, hundreds we're hearing from local councillors, and I'm sure Rachel Sweeney will tell us, still using generators. Could this be a moment of flux?
I think it certainly needs to be looked at again, the structure of the electricity market generally, but also what you were referring to was the supply side. And of course, what the governments did quite some time ago is separate transmission from generation and supply. And those companies we're referring to are the ones who then buy the electricity or the gas or whatever and then transmit it or sort of pass it on, sell it to individuals. Whereas the issue that we're debating right now, of course, is additional to all else, is the national grid.
The grid itself, which is a private company.
Well, absolutely. And of course, there are regional companies that are involved in the transmission process. The question is, have they invested enough? But remember, what's happened now is trees falling on cables. Okay, so we have a lot of over the land cables.
Yeah.
So what you could say is that perhaps we should have them all hidden, so that this sort of thing doesn't happen, particularly with climate change, where those storms are likely to be, we're told, a lot more frequent than we need to think.
But a private company isn't going to do that kind of long-term investment, is it? Because it doesn't make immediate commercial sense. This is a listed company, the National Grid. Short-term shareholders aren't going to thank it if it tries to solve problems that may happen in 20 years' time.
This is true, and there's been some concern about the amount of, or the size of the dividend payments that have been made over the last few years, which have been quite immense. I mean, perhaps some of that money could have been spent investing. But what we've also got is a series of government bodies, including BEIS, which is the government department responsible for this, including Ofgem, of course, which is the regulator. And the question is, can they do something more in terms of incentivizing companies that are involved in this transmission to do more in terms of the investment? And remember, we're talking about becoming a lot more electric. And all the points that we just made, that, we mentioned all this.
Our dependence is going up. Phones, cars.
Exactly. So how are we going to get the sort of power and the money to be able to invest in this extra grid power, which is going to be absolutely required? So yes, I think this is the moment to rethink whether the structure we've set up all those years ago, particularly, of course, under Margaret Thatcher at the time, and that was, of course, remember we had all these privatisations happening in the late 80s and then early 90s, whether you talk about gas, electricity or coal, which clearly have transformed the way in which electricity ends up being in people's homes.
We need to rethink, Scott, says Vicky Price. Well, you're a Labour councillor, I'm a Telegraph columnist, no less. Should we be renationalising parts of our electricity supply, in particular parts of our national grid?
What we should be doing, Liam, is having fundamental change to the way the power system is structured. What we should be doing is having power companies brought back into the public domain and serving the communities that they're supposed to serve. What we've heard there is huge dividends being paid out to private shareholders that want those shares to pay them dividends. They aren't necessarily as interested in communities as a public body would be. And as we encourage people to reduce their carbon footprint, as we encourage people to do things differently, and our dependence on electricity and other things heightens, it is absolutely the right thing to do to have a public sector body that takes back in and reinvests the money of structure. And I talked about it a lot yesterday in terms of the infrastructure that we have seen severely damaged is through lack of investment and not enough investment in the Northeast, which is always the same when it comes to this supposed levelling up programme. And what we need to do is absolutely have energy providers and energy companies working for the public. It is the government's responsibility to ensure that the public are cared for in every way, and that we have healthcare for that. We have the NHS, all these other things, absolutely fantastic organisations. What we don't have is anybody that's interested in ensuring that public communities, those most vulnerable, have access to decent power networks, which, quite frankly, for nearly 2 weeks being without power in 2021 is totally unacceptable.
You're watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. After the break, we'll keep this discussion going. Does our electricity sector need a shock? We'll be talking more to Labour leader for Druridge Bay in Northumberland, Scott James Dickinson, to the Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy at Imperial College, Malcolm Grinston, and, of course, in the studio, friend of the show, former government economist Vicky Price. Your emails are flooding in thick and fast. It's a touchy subject. We'll be reading some of those shortly. Stay with us. You're On the Money.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Storm Barra may be now easing, but it stays windy through the rest of today with further showers or, in some places, prolonged rain. But there will be some drier periods. Barra is still centred across the UK, but it's filling. It's becoming less severe. Nevertheless, strong winds continue to rotate around that low, particularly around the peripheries of it, northeast Scotland into parts of Northern Ireland, West Wales and the southwest. And it's for West Wales as well as the southwest where the strongest wind gusts will be this afternoon, 65-mile-per-hour wind gusts, risk of disruption. And further bands of showers and rain affecting northeast Scotland, Northern Ireland, parts of Western England and Wales. Prolonged rain in places. So feeling quite cold where we've got the rain coming through, where we've got that strong wind. Highs of just 8 Celsius. But there will be some drier weather. The Midlands, East Anglia, South East England, Western Scotland, the favoured spots for some drier and brighter interludes at times through the day and overnight. Clearing skies across parts of northern UK in particular, with lighter winds eventually will lead to a touch of frost in places, say for North East England, parts of central Scotland. Otherwise, lots of cloud and further showers coming and going, 1 or 2 making their way further east as we start off Thursday. But eventually, by the afternoon, things do start to brighten up. Cloudy initially in the east, but by the afternoon, sunny spells coming through. Whilst a reversal of fortunes further west, it turns cloudy with areas of rain moving in by mid-afternoon. And milder air returns to the southwest, 12 Celsius here, whilst it stays cold, where we've got the brighter weather further east. The cloud and rain make their way across the country during the evening. Some mountain snow for Scotland, followed by showers, and those showers will continue into Friday, particularly across western parts of the country, but there'll be some sunshine in between. And Saturday sees another area of rain move in from the west. It will also turn milder.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. You're on the money with me, Liam Halligan. We're discussing the future of the UK power industry and the National Grid, a private company, after tens of thousands of households were left without power in the aftermath of Storm Arwen. And only now, 12 days later, are the last households finally seeing their power restored. And still, lots of them are using generators. I'm still with my expert panel, the councillors, Scott James Dickinson, the Labour leader of Northumberland's County Council, and we have Malcolm Grimston, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy at Imperial College. And then in the studio, on the Money regular, Vicky Price, former co-head of the government's Economic Service. Malcolm, let's go to you, if I may. How unusual is the UK system where we have a private electricity grid? It wasn't always that way, of course, as Vicky was outlining before the break. And we have private power generation and distribution companies. How unusual is that? And how likely is it, do you think, that there'll now be a high-level debate about the ownership structure of our national grid?
It's pretty mainstream in Europe. In fact, the European Union for many years has been putting great pressure on companies to what they call unbundle their power industry. So as Vicky was saying, separating off generation into one function, transmission and distribution into a second function. That's getting it from the power stations to the local areas. And then supply, so basically the relationship with the customer, into a third area. And to introduce competition at the generation and the supply sides. The transmission distribution is different because it's a natural monopoly. It makes absolutely no sense to have competing wires, given the capital cost of them. It would be an enormous waste of resources. So rather like rail track, as you were talking about earlier, they are monopolies which are heavily regulated and which have to get permission from their regulator, Ofgem in the case of the electricity industry, in order to spend money on investment. But that's pretty mainstream across Europe. There are some, like Sweden, which have a kind of public-private partnership in their generation. EDF in France is nationalised, but the state still basically runs it. So, privatised, but the state still basically runs it. But this has been the model really since the 1980s. Chile, funnily enough, was the first country in the world to start this process of privatisation and competition. The UK very much took up the gauntlet with the big privatisations of the 80s and 90s. And many other countries have followed. So Germany, Belgium, pretty much all the major economies, Italy in Europe, have a fairly similar product. And of course, most of our electricity supply is in the hands of these big European companies like EDF, like E.ON and RWE Energy, which are German companies. Scottish Power is now owned by Iberdrola from Portugal, from Spain, sorry. So it is genuinely an international business, with this model being pretty well established across Europe at the moment, and indeed in many other areas, such as some areas of the United States.
Vicky, briefly, there's a lot going on in government, isn't there? I mean, just watching Gloria De Piero's show earlier, the Prime Minister's pretty busy, but do you think civil servants will be thinking through this? Do you think ministers of state will be thinking through this? It does seem like a bit of a turning point.
Well, absolutely, particularly if people start getting really annoyed about what's been going on, higher prices you were mentioning earlier, plus, of course, the outages that we've seen right now. Is this the model that can continue? But we've got to bear in mind that competition has reduced over a period of time the prices that people have been paying. And until very recently, electricity and gas prices were very low in the UK. And that's what encouraged, of course, quite a lot of companies to come in and buy cheap energy and then sell it to the consumer with a small little margin. So I think that is the moment now, with everything going in the wrong direction, for that to be looked at again.
Scott James Dickinson, let's go back to you. This is all about, after all, the people on the ground, people who have suffered, people who have lost their electricity supply, people who are still using generators and will be using generators through the Christmas period, it seems. Do you think there's appetite in your part of the world, among your voters, for some kind of root and branch reform here?
I think, Liam, there has to be, doesn't there? I don't think we can just ignore what's been happening. And it's not just this storm, it's other storms as well, where we're hit quite badly with poor infrastructure, old infrastructure, lack of investment because of the size of the dividends and things that others want. This network, I think Malcolm's right in terms of the generation of the power is very different to its supply on the network around the country. I think that's where we have public responsibility to make sure that all communities have access to it with resilient infrastructures. We currently don't have that. We have large dividends being paid out instead, which could have been invested in the structures around the country.
Thank you all for a good discussion. Thank you to Scott James Dickinson, County Councillor for Droridge Bay in Northumberland. Malcolm Grimston, of course, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy at Imperial College, and, of course, Vicky Price here in the studio. Thanks to all three of you. We will continue this important discussion here on The Money, as I said, in-depth conversations with people who really know their stuff. Talking of which, let's cross over to our Angel of the North. It's the GB News North East reporter. There she is, Rachel Sweeney. She's reporting from County Durham, which has been affected by Storm Arwen and, more recently, by Storm Barra, of course. Rachel, we've been nerding on about the future structure of the electricity industry in the UK. You've been talking to people, hundreds of them, who've lost their homes, lost their power to their homes in your area due to these storms.
It's just been so deflating and disappointing, and people aren't prepared to dismiss the lack of efficiency that we've seen when it's come to restoring the power in so many places. It's hard to celebrate that everyone has power because some people are still relying on generators. We don't know when that's going to come back on. I saw a few generators when I was driving through Concert this morning for the Great British Breakfast. Now we have, what's left of Storm Barra, and Northern Power Grid told us that was going to hinder even more the clean-up from Storm Arwen. So it really just feels at the moment like it's one thing after another and there really is no end in sight. But what we need to think about is how this has affected real people on the ground, like you said. And in Northumberland, it was the worst hit. Northumberland saw winds of up to 98 miles an hour in Storm Arwen. 12 days later, people up there still without power, and people are arguing that that's completely unacceptable. You might remember that I did a report from Alnwick Town Juniors Football Club where the whole roof blew off, and for me, that the heart of that story, it's a registered charity, which is unusual for a grassroots football club, a £1.1 million facility. It took them 6 years to get that off the ground, and in a couple of hours it was completely destroyed and taken from them. they were really holding back the tears when they were talking about it. It was devastating. I also went to a greyhound kennels in Trimdon in County Durham, where they had to rescue 37 dogs, and they did it remarkably in 45 minutes because the roof had blown off there. So it's these real stories that people are talking about now, and that sense of community, because although we keep saying community is crucial at a time like this, the argument is, should it be? Should it have to be?
As ever, Rachel, I'm in the studio wanging on about policy, and you're there in a magnificent bobble hat talking to ordinary people. What a heart-rending story, not only about the kennels, but also the local football club. You're a resilient people, you lot in the North East, aren't you, as you know well. How thin is patience wearing, Rachel, with the fact that there will now be households using generators over Christmas?
I really try and pride myself on bringing you some positivity from the northeast of England, but this has just been a really rough couple of weeks for people. I spoke to a family in Northumberland who said that in 3 generations they've never seen anything like this. Northern Power Grid have said it's the worst storm they've had to deal with in 20 years, but nobody can remember anything like this. I wish you'd seen the roads were covered in trees, people couldn't get out of villages. There was a gentleman who had hot water. He was one of the only people in his village, and he was taking it round to other people so they could try and make a cup of tea. And it really is that heart that's what's kept us going through this, is the North East spirit, nothing else.
As ever, Rachel Sweeney, GB News North East reporter up there in County Durham. Stay warm. Thank you very much. You're watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Coming up, it's today's Money Talks interview with global risk expert Nick Allen, the man with a plethora of advice on how to protect your business from risks, including cyber attacks.
You need to have a backup of your information, of your client's information, and you need to know how to use your backup. And there are, lots of firms that help people do that. But if you haven't got a backup, you need a backup.
Important stuff there. A rare interview with the CEO of Control Risks. But before that, it's the GB News headlines with Paul Hawkins.
Thanks, Liam. Our top story at 1:30. Boris Johnson has ordered an investigation into an alleged Downing Street Christmas party after a heated Prime Minister's questions. It follows a video leaked to ITV News showing the PM's former press secretary, Allegra Stratton, answering questions during a mock briefing 4 days after the alleged party happened, while the country was under lockdown restrictions. The Prime Minister apologised for any offence caused by the clip, but Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says it raises more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson is believed to be considering new COVID restrictions, including orders to work from home and vaccine passports to manage the Omicron variant. Downing Street sources insist no decision has been made, but there is widespread speculation that further measures could be imminent. From today, if you're over 40 years old in England, you can now book your COVID booster jab 3 months after receiving your second dose of the vaccine. It follows official figures showing 101 additional cases of the Omicron variant in the UK, with the total now reaching 437. Roughly 1,000 properties are without power after Storm Barra swept across the country. The power cuts follow Storm Arwen, which caused catastrophic damage to electricity networks. Flood warnings have also been issued across the UK, and a yellow weather warning for wind is in place across the west coast of Wales and southwest England until 6 p.m. Those are your top stories for now. I'll have more on all those headlines in half an hour.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. You're on the money with me, Liam Halligan. Lots of you getting in touch about the national grid, failures of electricity companies, people still using generators after Storm Arwen in the run-up to Christmas. Jeff says anyone who lives in a remote area where their electricity is supplied via post-mounted overhead cables will always be at risk from nearby trees. The option is to bury the cables. But who pays? Good question, Jeff. These customers should have their own contingencies, such as their own generators. Mac emailed us to say storms are not political. The main problem is that these areas haven't been managed properly by Labour. This is just the tip of the iceberg, I reckon. Alex says the electric grid needs massive investment, not just because of storms, but because the future, according to government plans, is electric heating and electric transport. Very good point. Keep your emails coming. We learn lots from them. Tell me what you want to be discussed. On the Money is your show too. Now, it's time for my daily interview series. Here it is. It's Money Talks. Now, it's a big, bad world out there with lots of risks and uncertainties, particularly for firms that operate abroad. And the more far-flung and exotic the country you're working in, the more practical, legal and political uncertainties there are likely to be. As it happens, the UK boasts a number of highly respected, long-established firms which specialise in risk management, providing on-the-ground assistance, intelligence and general support, mainly to corporate clients. One of the best-known such firms is called Control Risks, which has almost 50 years' experience managing everything from kidnap and ransom situations to providing specialised political, corporate and strategic intelligence. For this latest Money Talks, I was granted a rare interview with Control Risks CEO Nick Allen, a man with an interesting past. And I started by asking him what a firm like Control Risks actually does.
We describe ourselves as a specialist risk consultancy. So we advise primarily business. We do work for some governments, but primarily business. And we help them, the sort of strap line is help them become secure, compliant, resilient, sustainable. We provide information to help them make better business decisions, and we also advise business on crises, how to prepare for them, deal with them, and then recover. That's sort of our world, if that brings it a little bit to life.
And a lot of the work that you do is in overseas places, some far-flung markets, but Control Risk has been around for a long time, right?
So we've been around for coming on 47 years, and we started in the area of responding to kidnap and extortion. We still do that with a world-leading company in advising people on that particular risk. Yes, we work in far-flung places, but we also work very close to home. We do a lot of work in the UK and in the European Union. So I think one of the things that's changed for a lot of businesses is when I joined the firm, and that was 20 years ago, quite a lot of what we did was, say, for UK businesses or US, Japanese big client base there. And risk was sort of out there, whether it was political risk or security risk. I think one of the things that changed is risk is here as well, and that's political as well as security issues that we advise companies on. So without wishing to sound too depressing, sort of risk is everywhere, I guess, and we're helping firms deal with that.
How would you assess the extent of geopolitical risk in the world at the moment? The UK is obviously a very outward-facing economy. We trade all over the place. The world's becoming more globalised. Or is it, after the pandemic, another issue there? But do you think the world is particularly risky at the moment?
I think I mean, there's always risk, isn't there? And we're more aware of it because of the ubiquity of information that we have. I think someone said a few years back, globalization has had a heart attack. It's not dead. It's in the recovery room, as it were. And I think there's some
with the pandemic.
With geopolitics, and that was said before the pandemic. Okay. I think what we have seen everywhere around the world, and this is something we and others have been talking about, has been the increase in political nationalism, increase in trade barriers. If you look at just about every metric, you can see increases in barriers to trade, apart from Africa, actually. Africa is sort of moving in the other direction in some ways. So it is harder, I think, getting harder for business. And, and we're all aware of this, just a huge increase in regulation and things that businesses rely on, like free movement of data, getting harder and harder. You've got lots of new data laws coming in. And certainly, if you look at it now, and we're looking forward into 2022, for a lot of businesses and people like me and yourself, we grew up in an era where the kind of rules were clear.
Yeah.
It's much less clear.
I think maybe what you were referring to earlier was the emergence of Donald Trump, a much spikier relationship between the two biggest economies in the world, the US and China. That spikiness has continued now. You've been in this business a long time, if I may say so, Nick. How would you assess sort of Sino-Western relations at the moment?
Poor would probably be my sort of overarching summary. What Trump articulated, actually, if you look at the one thing I think that drew together the US political, Democrat, Republican, was actually a concern about the rise of China from an American perspective. And actually, he got a lot of sort of cross-party support and articulated, I think, a concern that was also being felt elsewhere. And this is, you have a rising economy, a huge population, and a country that is looking to project its power and influence abroad. And there have been, a number of books written on this subject about sort of when empires fall and new empires emerge. And it rarely happens without friction. I think we are now in an age of confrontation, and that doesn't necessarily mean sort of military confrontation, but there is economic, technological, cultural, political confrontation between China, which wishes to assert itself, protects its interests as China would see it. I think it's important to understand there's obviously a Chinese perspective on what's going on. And business is actually finding itself quite often caught in the crossfire.
Of course. We don't always notice what's going on, do we, when we're focused on news in our own country? There's been a huge increase in recent weeks of Chinese military planes in Taiwanese aerospace. That could really be a flashpoint, couldn't it? Because the Chinese feel that Taiwan is part of, if not mainland China, then certainly part of the People's Republic in general. And yet Taiwan is kind of a US ally. To what extent do you think we're ignoring the danger that China poses?
So, I mean, we talk specifically about Taiwan. That is China has always been, the People's Republic of China has always been very clear that Taiwan remains part of China, and Taiwanese governments flirt with declaring independence, but they fear going there. Taiwan is a US ally. I mean, in terms of people were, I think, misreading into the speed with which the US left Afghanistan, that they might sort of similarly abandon their ally Taiwan. Totally different. The US has huge political and economic interest in Taiwan, but Taiwan has huge economic interest in China. There's a lot of Taiwanese investment in China. You have a slowing Chinese economy. It's not growing as fast as it used to. Taiwan is one of those sort of hot button nationalist issues. Some people might say sort of Anglo-French fishing relations work similarly. So I think we don't see a military confrontation happening. There will be saber rattling. There's always the risk for miscalculation. But when I was talking to our team in China just last week, I was sort of discussing this, and they said, look, absolutely it's headline news, but if you're a business, international business operating in China, you're much more worried about Chinese regulators, the tightening of regulatory investigations that have been going on in China, the sort of internal politics of China present more of an issue for business to get its head around than actually the sort of headline news that is sort of, are we going to go to war over Taiwan? I don't think we are.
We should be in no doubt, though, that you have America as the world's leading economy, the global hegemon, if you like, as it has been pretty much for our entire lives. That's now shifting. Under some definitions, China is the biggest economy in the world already. That shift isn't going to happen without some kind of aggro, is it? I mean, these are very competitive countries run by very competitive people. I mean, how can Britain position itself? How can British business position itself as this global centre of gravity shifts as it now is?
I think we're not at the end of the age of the American superpower. If you look militarily and the ability to project power abroad, the US is unrivaled. If you look at the number of, just sort of aircraft carriers China has versus the United States, there was the thing this week about China increasing its nuclear warheads, still dwarfed by what the US has. So there's a bit of perspective, and in terms of GDP per capita, the US is still an economic superpower and will continue to be. But what you have is a US less interested in projecting that power and influence. I think bruised from multiple conflicts in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And for Britain, which is an interesting question, brands Britain as a sort of business brand, I think remains very strong, particularly in places where we're known for, professional services, some of our industry, manufacturing, creative arts. There's opportunity there. We are a trading nation. We always have been. And, notwithstanding tensions with the European Union at the moment, Britain, I think our position remains to sort of exploit the strengths that we have. We remain on the UN Security Council. We have a security capability that probably is stronger than, it's always been strong, and we still have that. So I guess in that mix, Britain has opportunity, but we can't be complacent.
Let's talk about cybercrime. Obviously, it's a growing threat. Ordinary householders can have their bank hacked, they can have their identity stolen, and so on. Have we seen anything yet? Could this become a much bigger trend? Nick, how worried are big business about cyber attacks?
If it's not in the top 1 or 2 items on a business risk register, they should look at their risk register again.
Crikey.
I mean, it is a huge issue. And since during the pandemic, there was an explosion in cybercrime, particularly ransomware. And we as a firm that respond to that just saw that, just a massive demand.
Just describe to us what ransomware is.
So when you accidentally, your computer is affected by a program that encrypts all your files, and a little message pops up and says, if you're an individual, probably pay me a few hundred to a few $1,000s to get your information back. If you're a business, and we've seen some of these, pay X million dollars and we will unencrypt your information.
You're far too professional to even think about disclosing client confidentiality, and I hope I'm not stupid enough to ask. But what size of companies are we talking about that you've dealt with who have been hit with ransomware?
Well, I'm not going to talk about who we've worked for, but some very big sort of, headline cyber attacks. Colonial Pipeline in the States, probably, the big one last year. SolarWinds, which was again another that was attributed to Russian software. But for all businesses,
and these ransoms get paid.
These ransoms do get paid. It is a crime that's very hard to solve, and it's facilitated, let's be clear, by Bitcoin,
cyber currencies that can't be traced.
That can't be traced.
Or very difficult to trace.
Very difficult to trace. So for all business, I think, and it's not just ransomware, it's hacks, it's data theft. And the challenge with a data theft is it's very hard to know what's actually happened. It can take quite a long time to really get a sense of, has the data really been taken, what's been taken, and under regulations, you have to report relatively quickly before you may know what's happened. So this is really a challenging risk for business, and it's going to get worse. We see cybercrime following geopolitical tension. We've already talked about geopolitical tension. We see the leaking of state-level capability to criminal groups. So you now have criminal groups with really very sophisticated software capabilities to prosecute this kind of crime, and the resources of business to stand up to that. The really big businesses, the banks are heavily regulated. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars, pounds, euros on this. But for medium-sized business, it's harder, and smaller businesses even harder to protect against this. So this absolutely is a critical risk for business, and it's going to get worse, unfortunately.
You talked about small and medium-sized businesses there, Nick. If somebody watching this has a relatively small business, they might have, client bank accounts on the business, standing orders that have been set up and so on. How can they go about making just simple precautions to make their business more resilient to cyber attack?
Resilience is a good word, isn't it? You need to have a backup of your information, of your client's information, and you need to know how to use your backup. And there are lots of firms that help people do that. But if you haven't got a backup, you need a backup. That's my sort of number. If we were asking sort of what's your business tip, I'd say number one, have a backup of your information. And you need to also thought through how long can you trade and operate if you can't access that information. And you are seeing, unfortunately, small, medium-sized businesses being hit and really not knowing kind of what to do. But there are, companies that will support. There are lots of companies that, and the UK, if we're talking about the UK, has a very strong capability in the area of, cybersecurity and preventing this. We have in GCHQ, I guess, a world-leading organisation, and people have come out of that and set up businesses. And actually, in terms of, you asked me where can Britain sort of succeed? I think our cyber security capability is an area where we have real strength, and I think you already see that, and you're going to see more of that. British firms trading around the world.
COP26 has obviously been big news this month. Do you think the UK does need to worry about its energy security? We haven't got much gas storage these days. President Macron's threatening to turn off the interconnectors. We're pretty reliant, aren't we, on that gas pipeline from Norway. What's the sort of big picture view of risk specialists like you when people ask about energy security in the UK?
Well, I saw in one of your previous interviews, Liam, you asked a Norwegian gentleman about how Norway viewed our lack of gas storage facilities, and he was very diplomatic. It's quite clear in terms of how sort of pipelines have been built that, Russia is well aware of how much gas it supplies to Europe, and that does provide
40% of Western Europe's gas.
Exactly,
still.
And we know that, and they know that, and there's positives and negatives to that. It creates an interdependence, but at the same time, it does. Energy supply has always given countries leverage throughout time. So. Why we have not insufficient gas storage, certainly compared to mainland Europe, that's a question I'm not equipped to answer, but we do need to worry about energy supply. We're building renewable power. We have, I guess, oil and gas reserves of our own, but yeah, it's a critical issue, and we've seen that in the price spikes. Things that the British government, try as it might, can't really control, I guess, without spending billions in subsidies. So it's a real issue, and you're going to see that around the world. These energy has always been a source of tension. Many people may not have noticed, but Algeria has just refused to supply gas through the Moroccan pipeline to Spain just this week. And that is creating sort of tensions between Spain, Morocco, Algeria. Algeria and Morocco have sort of poor relations. But that's a sort of small example of, I think, an issue that is kind of out there and is going to define, the next while.
How interesting was that? Nick Allen, the CEO of Control Risks. And you can see the full strength, long version of that interview on my Money Talks podcast or the GB News YouTube channel. It'll be up there soon. The podcast has many conversations with major players in the world of business, finance and economics, and some not so major players. The question is whether or not they're interesting. And they all are. You've been watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Thanks for joining me today. Tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. for more economics, business and consumer news. We'll be covering the Scottish budget. I'll be back in just a moment with Gloria De Piero. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and that was On the Money.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Storm Barra may be now easing, but it stays windy through the rest of today with further showers or, in some places, prolonged rain. But there will be some drier periods. Barra is still centred across the UK, but it's filling. It's becoming less severe. Nevertheless, strong winds continue to rotate around that low, particularly around the peripheries of it, northeast Scotland into parts of Northern Ireland, West Wales and the southwest. And it's for West Wales as well as the southwest where the strongest wind gusts will be this afternoon, 65-mile-per-hour wind gusts, risk of disruption. And further bands of showers and rain affecting northeast Scotland, Northern Ireland, parts of Western England and Wales. Prolonged rain in places. So feeling quite cold where we've got the rain coming through, where we've got that strong wind, highs of just 8 Celsius. But there will be some drier weather. The mid